morning after the Coyotes came, the light on the ridge above the Marchand place was the pale white light that only comes in February. It fell across the pasture in a way that made everything look older than it was. The frost had held through the night, and the ground was hard enough that a boot heel would not break it. The hens were quiet inside the henhouse, though a person who knew that flock would have said they were quieter than usual, the way animals go quiet when they have been through something and are still working out whether it is over. The boy who stood at the edge of the hedge was 16 years old, and his name was Elias Marchand. He had not slept, or he had slept the way a person sleeps when he has spent 3 years building a thing and finally has to find out whether the thing works. Sitting up, in his clothes, with the window open 2 inches so he could hear, he had heard the yipping start along the tree line at the top of the pasture around 2 in the morning, and he had heard it move down the slope in the way water moves down a slope, slowly, and then faster, and then all at once. He had heard it stop when it reached the henhouse. He had heard it circle. He had heard the sound of digging, which was a sound he had never heard before at that distance, but which he understood immediately and completely because the reason he had spent 3 years bleeding for a fence made out of sticks was that particular sound. He had heard the digging stop. He had heard the pack move on toward the creek. He was standing at the edge of the hedge now in the February light, and he was looking at what the night had left behind. The ground on the outside of the hedge was churned up in a wide band around the whole circumference. In 3 places, the churning had turned into serious digging, holes 4 or 5 inches deep, pushed into the frozen earth, and at the bottom of each hole was what had stopped the digging. A mat of hawthorn root, woven so tightly through itself over 3 growing seasons that a man with a shovel would have needed the better part of an hour to get through it. What the coyotes had, which was time and hunger and their front paws, had not been enough. At knee-height, caught on the outward-facing thorns, along a stretch of hedge, maybe 6 feet wide, was a tuft of gray fur. It was small, it was not much, but it was the color of a shoulder that had tried to force itself through and had thought better of the attempt. Elias reached out and touched it with 2 fingers. The thorn had held it the way a fishhook holds. Whatever animal had left it there had walked away with less fur than it came with, and would remember for the rest of its life that the fence around the Marchand henhouse was not the kind of fence you tried twice. Inside the henhouse, all 200 of his mother's laying hens were alive. He stood there a long time. He did not smile. He did not go inside to tell anyone. He would tell his mother when she came out for the morning gather. And he would tell his father, who was already up somewhere on the property, doing the things his father did in the pre-dawn hours without announcing them. But right now, in the light that had not yet warmed enough to melt the frost, Elias Marchand did what he had done 1,000 times over the last 3 years. He walked the hedge. He walked slowly all the way around with one hand resting on the top of the woven growth as he went. He checked the base at each of the 3 dig sites. He noted where the thorn had bent under pressure and sprung back. He noted where a stem needed to be retied come spring. He noted the tuft of fur, and then the second tuft of fur further along that he had not seen from where he had been standing, and then a third smaller one. And he did not touch these last 2 because he understood that they had been earned by the hedge and did not need to be handled by him. When he had walked the whole circumference, he stopped where he had started. He stood at the northwest corner, which was the corner closest to the ridge, which was the corner he had built first, and had planted with the Osage orange because he had known, even at 14, that if anything ever came, it would come from there. Something had come from there, the hedge had held. To understand how a boy who was not yet 15 years old had come to plant a hedge like that, in a county where every henhouse in living memory had been wrapped in wire and patched every spring, you have to go back a little further. You have to go back to a summer before any of this began, when Elias Marchand was 13 years old and had not yet touched a hawthorn cutting or a billhook, and to the woman on the top of a hill on Dobbins Road who had lived in that same house since the summer of 1938. The Marchand place sat in the middle of Perry County, Tennessee, on 160 acres that had belonged to the family since 1921. It was cattle land, mostly, with a hay operation that kept them through the winters, and a laying flock that Odine Marchand had built up over 11 years into something close to 200 birds. The eggs went to a co-op over in Linden and to 3 restaurants in Hohenwald, and in a lean year, the egg money was the difference between a hard winter and a bad one. The land ran up against a hardwood ridge on the north side, oak, hickory, a tangle of understory that hid whatever wanted hiding. Creeks cut through the property in every direction, and the pasture where the henhouse sat began to slope upward about 60 yards from the barn, the ground tilting slowly toward the wooded rise that had always been there and had always been the reason the family did not trust the fence line more than they trusted it. Corwin Marchand was the father. He was 51 years old that summer. He was a cattleman and a fencing man, And he was the kind of man who did not waste words the way some men do not waste money. He had a habit of standing at the edge of the barn lot with his hands in his back pockets, looking at a piece of the property, working something out in his head, and then going and fixing it without discussing it with anyone. He was sparing with praise. He was sparing with criticism. He was sparing with most things. Odine Marchand ran the flock. She was 3 years younger than her husband, and she had a way of moving through the yard early in the mornings, when the birds were beginning their small, purposeful sounds, that suggested a person who had made peace with what her days were going to be. She had grown up with her father's chickens down near Waynesboro, and she had brought that patience with her to the Marchand place the day she came onto it as a bride, and she had never once mentioned the calluses on her hands to anyone. Landry Marchand was the older son. He was 17. He was loud in the way that a young man is loud when he has not yet been told what the world costs. He was good with an engine and could tear down a small tractor and put it back together in an afternoon. And he laughed a lot, and he did not always know when the laughter was the right kind. He worked hard, and his father was proud of him in the quiet way his father was proud of anything. And there was nothing wrong with Landry that a few more years would not fix. He simply had not lived long enough yet to know that some things you learn to keep to yourself. Elias was the younger son. He was 13 years old the summer this story begins, and he was the quiet one. He was the one who walked the tree line at dusk for no reason anyone could name. He was the one who noticed things a boy his age was not supposed to notice, and did not say them out loud because he had learned early that saying them did not usually make anything better. He had found a calf dead in the draw the previous September, before the buzzards had even started their circling, because he had noticed that the mother had been standing wrong in the pasture that morning. He had gone back with his father, and they had worked out together what had happened. And Corwin had put his hand on the back of his son's neck when they were done briefly, and had walked back to the barn without saying anything. Elias had understood the hand. That autumn had noticed something else about the pasture. He had noticed that the deer had stopped bedding in the low ground the way they usually did, and had moved up toward the ridge. He did not know what it meant. He did not tell anyone. He watched it, and he filed it away the way he filed everything else. The summer he was 13, Elias took a job helping an old woman named Odessa Halloran with her firewood. The arrangement had come about the way arrangements come about in a place like Perry County. Somebody said something to somebody at the feed store. Corwin heard it. The old woman needed help with her wood. She would pay $2 an hour, which was not much even then, but it was steady and it was work. Corwin came home one evening and set his coffee down on the kitchen table and told Elias without looking up that he could earn his own money that summer if he was willing to walk up Dobbins Road 3 mornings a week and split what Odessa Halloran needed splitting. Elias had walked up that road the following Tuesday. The house sat at the top of a long climb past the last pavement on a piece of ground that looked out over the whole east end of the county. It was a small house, painted white so long ago that the paint had gone the color of an old fingernail. There was a porch with a rocking chair on it that had one arm patched with black tape, and a screen door that had been rehung so many times that the frame had gone soft at the corners. Behind the house was a kitchen garden. The kitchen garden was ringed by a hedge. Elias saw the hedge before he saw the woman. He was 13 years old, and he had walked up a country road on a summer morning to split firewood for $2 an hour. And he had come around the side of the little white house, and there was this thing standing there in the grass. It was maybe 5 feet high, 3 feet thick at the base. It was so densely woven into itself that it did not look like plants at all. It looked more like a piece of architecture, something that had been built. But there were leaves on it, and small white blossoms on the far side where the light came through, and it was clearly alive, and clearly rooted, and it wrapped all the way around the kitchen garden in a shape that had been established a very long time ago. He was still standing there looking at it when the screen door opened behind him. Odessa Halloran was 79 years old that summer. She had been born in the front room of that house in 1938, and she had lived in it every year of her life since, except for a stretch of 3 years in the middle when her husband had been alive, and they had tried living down in the flat. She had come back after he passed. She had not left again. She was a small woman. She had white hair pulled back tight against her scalp. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had done every kind of work a woman does on a piece of land like that one. And she looked at the boy on her lawn without a great deal of expression, the way a person looks at a thing that has been sent to them and needs to be sorted through before it can be understood. "You, Elias." Yes, she nodded once. She did not smile. "Wood is out back. Maul is against the shed. Try not to leave it in the grass when you are done." She turned to go back inside. She stopped with her hand on the screen door. "Water is in the pump, if you get hot." She went in. The screen door closed behind her the way that particular kind of screen door closes, with a small dry sound and then a small dry sound after it. Elias split wood that morning until his shoulders burned. Then he split more. He was 13, and he was thin, and he was not particularly strong. But he had learned from his father that when you were being paid to do a thing, you did not stop until the person paying you told you to stop, or the thing was done. He worked through the morning. At noon, Odessa came out with a jar of cold water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth, and she set them down on the porch step without saying anything, and she went back in. He ate on the porch step. He looked at the hedge. He looked at it for a long time. That afternoon, when he had finished splitting what she had asked him to split, he walked around to the side of the house where she was working in the garden, and he stood at the edge of the hedge, and he looked at it up close. The hedge was not planted the way you would have planted a row of shrubs. The stems came out of the ground close together, maybe 6 or 7 inches apart, and then they bent. They bent low, near the ground, and ran horizontally through a woven structure of thicker stems that themselves ran through vertical stakes. From the woven horizontal frame, new growth had sent itself straight up year after year, so that the whole thing was a lattice of horizontal old wood and vertical new wood, tangled and thickened by decades of that same repeating pattern until it was solid. He could see that at the base, 6 inches from the ground, the mass of stems and thorn was so tight together that a mouse would have had trouble finding a way through. He looked at it a long time. Then he asked her about it. Odessa was down on her knees in the tomatoes. She did not stop working right away. She pulled the weed she had been working on. She set it in the bucket beside her. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the hedge. And she looked at it the way you look at someone who has been in your life a very long time. My grandfather set that in 1944, she said. Elias waited, hawthorn and blackthorn, laid over and woven while it was young. She reached out. She knocked her knuckles against the outer face of the hedge. It did not move. It did not even bend. Her knuckles made a small hard sound against the wood, the sound of a person knocking on a house. Nothing has ever gotten through it, she said. Not a dog, not a fox, not a deer. Wire rusts, wire gets pushed under. She paused. That does not. She looked at the boy. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the porch that morning, without a great deal of expression, but with the beginning of something behind her eyes that he did not have the vocabulary for yet. Then she went back to her weeding. Elias walked home that afternoon down Dobbins Road with his $2 an hour folded in his pocket and something else that he did not yet know what to do with folded inside his chest. He came back the following Tuesday. He came back every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday of that summer, and he split her wood, and he cleaned out the ditch along her drive, and he pulled the tomato vines when the frost took them in October. And each time he came, at some point during the morning or the afternoon, he found himself standing at the edge of the hedge, running his fingers along the woven horizontal wood, feeling the base of it where it met the ground and understanding, without being able to say it, that there was no gap. There was no place for anything to go under. The base was the densest part. The last day he worked for her that summer, in the 3rd week of August, Odessa came out onto the porch after he had finished stacking her final cord and set a small stapled booklet down on the porch step where his water jar had been sitting all summer. He picked it up. It was cheap paper, 15 or 20 pages stapled at the spine. The cover said laid hedges as livestock barriers. Below that it said the name of an agricultural extension office. Below that it said a year, and the year was 7 years before Elias Marchand had been born. He looked up. Odessa was standing on the porch. She was looking at him the way a person looks at another person when they have finally decided about something they have been considering for a while. You read that, she said. Yes, ma'am, you read it more than once. She turned to go back inside. You already know the shape of what you are going to do, she said. What is in that book is how it is done. The screen door closed behind her with the same small dry sound it always made. Elias walked down Dobbins Road that afternoon with the booklet in his back pocket. When he got home, he did not tell anyone about it. He went up to his room, and he sat on his bed and he read the booklet from cover to cover. He read it again the next day. He read it a 3rd time in early December, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, with a single lamp on and his mother's cast iron kettle ticking on the wood stove as it cooled. He read it a 4th time on Christmas night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was full of dinner, and he understood something on that 4th reading that he had not entirely understood on the first 3. The booklet did not describe a garden hedge. It described a fence. It described a fence that had been the standard livestock barrier across large parts of the English countryside for hundreds of years before wire fencing had ever been invented, and which had been carried over to the eastern United States by immigrants who had never in their lives owned a single roll of anything metal, and which had been used in this part of the country up until the point that cheap galvanized wire had made it no longer worth the labor. And it described how, done properly, this fence would keep out anything that walked on 4 legs. dogs, foxes, deer, and the animal the booklet did not name, but which Elias's mind supplied the moment he understood what he was reading, because he had walked the tree line at dusk enough times, and because he had noticed that the deer had moved up the ridge that autumn, and because he was the kind of boy who noticed things. Coyotes. He turned the booklet over on the kitchen table and looked at the back cover for a long time. In the second week of January, the winter he had turned 14 the previous November, Elias Marchand walked out to the shed behind the barn on a Saturday morning at first light, took down his father's old work gloves from the nail by the door, and began. The gloves were too big. The ground was frozen hard. The cuttings he had gathered over the previous 6 weeks, from the fence rows on his place and from the fence rows on Odessa's land where she had let him take what he needed, were stacked in 3 bundles wrapped in wet burlap against the north wall of the shed. Hawthorn, blackthorn, and along the uphill side where the pressure would be worst, a bundle of Osage orange he had traded a Saturday of hay hauling for. He carried the first bundle out to the flagged line he had walked and marked with baling twine over the last week of December. 60 yards from the barn, in a ring around the henhouse, following the natural slope of the ground so that the drainage would work with the plants and not against them. The line went all the way around, and he had measured it, and he knew that he needed roughly 400 cuttings to plant it at the 6-inch spacing the booklet had specified. He knelt in the frozen dirt. He put the point of a garden dibble to the ground. He drove it in with a hammer because that was the only way it was going to go in until the frost broke. He pulled it out. He fed a cutting into the hole. He tamped it down with the heel of his father's glove. He moved 6 inches to the left, and he did it again. His mother came out on the porch around 10. She stood there for a while with her coat wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him. She was not a woman who wasted words either. She waited until he looked up. "What are you doing?" "I am planting a fence." She looked at the cuttings. They were bare and gray. They were no thicker than a pencil. They were dead-looking in the way that dormant hardwood cuttings are dead, looking to anyone who has not been taught what to look for. She looked at her son. He was 14 years old. He was kneeling in the frozen dirt in his father's gloves, 60 yards from the barn, bleeding from a scrape across the back of his hand that he had not noticed yet, planting sticks in a ring around her henhouse in the middle of January. She did not say anything else. She went back inside. He worked through that Saturday until the light went. He came in with his hands stiff and cut and his knees soaked through, and he ate the dinner his mother put in front of him without saying much, and he went to bed. He worked the following Sunday from morning through the afternoon. He worked Monday before school and Monday after school, and he worked Tuesday before school and Tuesday after school. And by the end of the second Saturday, he had planted just over 300 of the 400 cuttings, and by the middle of the following week, he had planted the rest. He stood at the edge of the henhouse ring on a cold Wednesday evening, with the last of the daylight going out over the ridge, and he looked at what he had planted. It did not look like a fence. It did not even look like a plan. It looked like 400 short, bare sticks driven into the frozen ground in a ring around a chicken coop. He looked at it for a while. Then he went inside for dinner. Word about what Elias Marchand had been doing out on his father's place, that January had already started to travel by the time he finished planting. The Marchand property was not visible from the county road, but the henhouse was visible from the drive. And anyone who came up the drive to deliver feed or drop off mail or borrow a piece of equipment could see the ring of small, dark sticks that had appeared around the coop. In the 2 weeks the boy had been working. The word first landed, so far as anyone could later say for certain, at Miss Yarbrough's feed store down at the intersection of Route 13 and County Line Road. Miss Yarbrough had run that store for 28 years. She knew everyone. She knew whose son was doing what, and whose daughter had gone off to school in Nashville, and whose barn cat had disappeared, and whose combine had blown a hydraulic line. She did not gossip in the sense of making things up. She simply passed along what people told her. And by the time it had passed through her once, it had the quiet authority of something that had already been decided. The first week of February, Elias came in to buy more burlap. He needed it to wrap the base of the cuttings against the rabbits. He had read about the rabbits in the booklet. He had budgeted for the burlap out of his hay hauling money. He came in on a Thursday afternoon, and he set the 2 rolls he needed up on the counter. And Miss Yarbrough was ringing him up when the front door opened and Doyle Barclay came in. Doyle Barclay was 50 years old that year. He owned 400 acres of good bottom pasture north of the Marchand place, and he ran an operation that was a good deal larger than his father's had been. And he had spent $80,000 the previous summer on new galvanized wire and treated posts for the perimeter of his own farm. He was a big man. He wore a canvas coat with the collar turned up, and he moved through the doorway the way men who own 400 acres move through doorways in the town where their 400 acres are located. He clapped Miss Yarborough on the counter with the flat of his hand and asked after her mother. He looked over at Elias. He looked at the 2 rolls of burlap on the counter. He looked at Elias again. Then he grinned. "Miss Yarborough," he said. "This is the Marchand boy. Do you know what this boy has been up to over at his daddy's place?" Miss Yarborough looked at Elias. Doyle went on before she could answer. "He has been planting a garden around the henhouse." He paused for effect. "Decorative," he said. He laughed. It was a big, loose laugh, and it was meant to be shared. He clapped Elias on the shoulder with the same flat of the hand he had used on the counter, and he said something else about how nice it was to see a young man taking an interest in landscaping. And he winked at Miss Yarborough, and he went to the back of the store to pick up a spool of wire he had ordered. Elias did not answer. He counted out the bills for the burlap. He put the receipt in his shirt pocket. He picked up the 2 rolls and he walked out to the truck where his mother was waiting. He did not tell his mother what had been said. He did not tell his father what had been said. But the word decorative left Miss Yarborough's feed store that afternoon in Doyle Barkley's mouth, and it traveled the way that kind of word travels in a small county. By Sunday, it had reached the Kesslers. By the following Tuesday, it had reached Rufus Doak, who did not repeat it, because Rufus Doak did not repeat that kind of thing, but who did hear it. By the end of the month, it was the word that the men leaning on the counter at Miss Yarborough's used when they wanted to describe what the Marchand boy was doing out on his daddy's place. Landry heard it before his brother did. He heard it from a boy in his grade whose father had heard it at the feed store. He came home that evening with the word already sitting in his mouth, waiting to be said. He waited until dinner was over, and their mother had gone out to lock up the henhouse, and their father had gone out to the barn. And he found Elias on the back porch, sharpening the point of a new garden dibble with a small file, and he leaned in the doorway and he grinned. "Decorative," he said. Elias did not look up. "You know Dad already fenced that." Elias kept filing. Landry laughed. He was 17 and he was not being cruel. He was being what he was, which was a boy who had not yet lived long enough to understand that some things you learn to keep to yourself. He shook his head. He went inside. The screen door made its small, dry sound behind him. Elias sat on the porch a while longer with the file in his hand. He did not respond. He did not defend the hedge. He did not explain what a laid hedge was. He had learned already in some part of himself that would keep learning it for the rest of his life, that some people were not going to hear a thing no matter how you said it. He finished sharpening the dibble. He went inside. In the last week of February of that first year, on an afternoon when the sky had gone the color of wet slate and the wind was coming across the pasture out of the northeast, Elias was working on a section of the hedge along the uphill side, up near the Osage Orange, and he was trying to bend a particularly stubborn blackthorn whip into the position the booklet had described. The stem was thicker than he had expected. It did not want bend clean. It kept trying to snap at the base rather than fold, and every time he pushed it a little further, he could hear the fibers giving. And he knew that if he pushed too hard, he was going to lose the stem and have to cut a fresh one and start the whole section over. He was crouched down, working the stem with both hands, and he did not hear his father cross the yard. Corwin Marchand walked the 60 yards from the barn lot to where his younger son was working. He walked the way he walked everywhere on his own property, which was without hurry. He was wearing his old canvas coat and the leather gloves he kept on a nail inside the barn door. He came up behind Elias and he stopped and he watched for maybe 15 seconds. Then he stepped forward. He did not say anything. He crouched down beside his son. He reached out with one gloved hand and he took the top of the blackthorn stem, above where Elias was holding it, and he steadied it. He held it firm and straight up so that the pressure Elias was applying at the bottom could bend the stem cleanly at the point Elias had chosen, rather than at any other point along its length. Elias froze for a half second, then he pushed. The stem bent cleanly. It folded at the angle he had wanted. He held it there, and he wove it through the horizontal frame he had built, and he tied it off, and he sat back on his heels and he looked at what he had done. His father was already standing. Corwin looked at the section of hedge for maybe 2 seconds. Then he turned and he walked back across the yard toward the barn the way he had come, without a word, without looking at his son, without any suggestion at all that anything had passed between them. Elias stayed crouched in the frozen dirt with the billhook in his hand for a long time. He watched his father cross the yard. He watched his father go into the barn. Then he turned back to his hedge and he cut the next cutting to length, and he kept working. And something inside his chest that had been cold in a way he had not entirely admitted to himself was, for the first time in a long time, not cold. The rain came the last week of April. The hedge by then was 18 inches high in the best places, and had gaps in it along the east side where the frost had taken 30 of the original cuttings and where Elias's replacements had not yet caught. He knew about the gaps. He had noted them in the small pocket notebook he had begun to carry, with a pencil clipped to the front cover, and he had a plan for closing them the following winter. But the hedge was not a hedge yet. It was a promise of a hedge. It was 400 and change small, dark green shoots pushing tentative leaves out along the top of what still looked, from 20 feet away, like a ring of bare sticks in the grass. The rain that last week of April came sideways. It came for 2 days. On the second night, sometime after Elias had gone to bed, an opossum came down out of the ridge with the smell of the flock in its nose, and it worked its way along the outer face of the hedge, testing the base until it found what it was looking for. Along the east side, in one of the gaps Elias had already noted, where the spacing had been too wide because he had been 14 years old and he had made a mistake with the string when he was flagging the line back in December. The opossum went through. In the morning, Elias found 3 of his mother's hens dead inside the run, not eaten, not carried off, killed and left. He was standing in the run when Landry came out to see what had happened. Landry looked at the birds, he looked at the hedge, he looked at his brother, he grinned. "Your garden is really coming along, Elias." Elias did not answer. He picked up the 3 dead hens one by one and he carried them to the compost pile behind the barn. Then he went back to the hedge, he got his notebook out of his back pocket, he walked the east side slowly. He measured the spacing between his living cuttings with a folding wooden ruler he had taken out of the shed. He did the math in his head. He wrote in the notebook in a small tight hand, east side spacing too wide. Replant closer, 5 inches, not 8, wrap base with burlap, everyone, he underlined it once. Then he closed the notebook and he put it back in his pocket, and he stood at the edge of the hedge in the wet grass with his father's gloves in his hand, and he looked at the ridge where the light was starting to break through the last of the rain. And he thought about the fence that was going to be there in 2 more years, and about the animals that had not yet come down off that ridge but that were going to come, and about the woman on top of Dobbins Road whose grandfather had planted a hedge in 1944 that a boy could still knock his knuckles against and hear the sound of a house. Corwin Marchand watched his younger son from the kitchen window. He watched him measure the east side of the hedge with a wooden ruler in the wet grass. He watched him write in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. He watched him close the notebook and put it back in his pocket and stand there a while longer, looking at the ridge. Then Corwin went back to his coffee, and he did not say anything to anyone about what he had seen. And the morning went on, the way mornings went on at the Marchand place. But something had shifted in the barn lot that spring, and it had not entirely finished shifting yet. And the man at the kitchen window knew it, in the quiet way he knew most things, though he was not going to be the one to say it out loud. That was going to take a while yet. That was going to take a hedge. The frost came on a Sunday night in the 3rd week of March, and it took the hedge harder than anything had ever taken anything on the Marchand place before. Elias had known a cold snap was coming. The forecast on the AM radio in the kitchen had said so, and the sky had said so more plainly than the forecast, and the way the barn cats had come inside and pressed themselves against the wood stove had said so more plainly still. He had wrapped what he thought needed wrapping. He had banked burlap around the base of the youngest cuttings on the north face, the ones he had put in during a break in the February weather to fill the gaps he had noted after the opossum. He had gone to bed thinking he had done what could be done. He had not done enough. The temperature dropped to 17 degrees around 3 in the morning. It held there for 6 hours. The wind came out of the northwest and cut across the top of the pasture, and the pasture had no windbreak on that side, because the ridge sat too far to the north to break wind from that quarter. When Elias walked out to the hedge the next morning, in the first gray light before school, he walked into a scene he did not immediately understand. The cuttings on the exposed side were black, not brown, not withered, black. The bark had gone the color of char, and the tender growth at the tips had curled downward on itself, and the smallest shoots had turned brittle enough that when he touched one, it snapped off in his hand and fell into the frozen grass like a piece of thin wire. He counted them. He walked the whole length of the exposed side, and he counted the cuttings that had gone black. 70. That was 1 out of every 6 he had planted. That was more than the entire east side replant he had done in February. That was 2 weeks of Saturdays gone. 2 weeks of Saturdays and every dollar he had saved out of hay hauling money since November. He stood there in the frost with his hands in his coat pockets, and he did not do what a 14-year-old boy might have been expected to do. He did not sit down in the grass. He did not put his face in his hands. He did not go inside and tell his mother. He went to school. He went to school because it was Monday, and because his mother did not know yet, and because he had not entirely worked out in his head what he was going to do about the 70 dead cuttings, and because staying home would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. He sat through his classes. He did not raise his hand. He did not answer when he was called on in the way that would have suggested he was somewhere else, though he was somewhere else. He was walking the north side of the hedge, in his mind counting again. He was thinking about the burlap wrap. He was thinking about the direction of the wind and about the angle at which he had planted the cuttings on the exposed face, and about whether he had planted them too shallow, and about whether the ground had been colder 6 inches down than he had realized when he had set them. He was thinking about the 70 dead cuttings, and about the 280 living ones, and about what the ratio meant for a hedge that needed to become a wall. He got off the school bus at 3:40. He went inside, he set his books on the kitchen table, he went out to the shed. He took down his father's gloves, and he took his bill hook off the wall, and he walked out to the north face of the hedge, and he began pulling out the 70 dead cuttings, one by one, and stacking them in a pile at the end of the row. His mother came out at 4:30. She had a mug of coffee for him. She did not ask what he was doing. She had been out to the hedge already that morning, before he had gone to school, and she had counted the dead cuttings before he had. And she had said nothing because there was nothing to say that he did not already know. She set the mug down on top of a fence post. She stood there a moment. "Ground is going to soften by Wednesday," she said. He nodded. "You want to ride to Yarborough's Saturday?" He nodded again. She went back inside. He worked until dark. He pulled the last of the dead cuttings by lamplight, and he stacked them in the corner of the shed to burn later. And he went inside and ate the dinner his mother had kept warm for him. And he did not say anything at the table about what had happened, and Landry did not know yet, and Corwin was not the kind of man to bring it up. The kitchen was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before that night, and after Elias went upstairs to bed, Corwin sat at the table with his second cup of coffee and did not say anything to his wife either, though they both understood what the quiet was about. Saturday morning, Elias rode into Yarborough's with his mother. He had $84 in his wallet from hay hauling, and he needed to come out with 100 new cuttings. And the math on that was not going to work unless Miss Yarborough was in a certain kind of mood. And Miss Yarborough had known Elias Marchand since he was 7 years old. She was in that kind of mood. She rang him up for $84 and change, and she did not comment on the number of cuttings. She wrote the receipt out by hand, and she slid it across the counter with one finger. She looked at the boy over the top of her reading glasses. "Long winter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, and she went back to her ledger. He carried the bundle out to the truck himself. He planted the new cuttings the following week, and he wrapped every one of them at the base with a double thickness of burlap tied off with kitchen twine. And he did not lose any of them to frost that season. He noted this in his notebook, in the small, tight hand he had been developing over the past 6 months. Wrap base with burlap, everyone. No exceptions. He had kept walking up Dobbins Road on Saturdays through that first winter, even after the summer wood-splitting arrangement had ended. He would sit on Odessa's porch for an hour and ask her the questions the booklet had not answered, and she would answer in her way, which was to say not always directly. And he would walk back down the road with the answers folded into his chest the same way the booklet was folded in his back pocket. She had a way of turning a question sideways before she answered it, and of leaving out the part she thought he ought to work out for himself. And Elias had begun to understand that this was itself a kind of teaching. Late in that same winter, in a stretch of cold that came at the end of February, when everyone had begun to think the worst of it was over, the rabbits came down out of the tree line. Elias did not see the damage right away. He had been checking the base of the hedge every morning. But he had been checking for frost heave and for wind damage and for the kind of surface problems he had learned to look for, and he had not been looking closely at the bark. The rabbits worked at night. They worked in the space between the burlap wrap and the ground, in the 2-inch gap where the wrap ended and the frozen dirt began, and they stripped the bark off the base of the young cuttings in a ring all the way around. They took bark from 30 of the plants before he realized what was happening. He realized what was happening on a Sunday morning in early March when he crouched down to check a wrap that had come loose in the wind and saw the pale wood underneath, chewed clean to the cambium in a smooth ring 1.5 inches above the soil line. A cutting girdled that way is finished. The plant cannot move water up past the wound. It will leaf out one more time in the spring, using what is stored in the stem above the damage, and then it will die. He walked the hedge. He counted 30. He sat down in the grass. He sat there a long time. Then he got up and he walked back to the shed, and he took the burlap he had left over from the frost repair, and he cut it into narrower strips. And he wrapped every remaining cutting at the base with a second layer that went a full 4 inches above the ground, tied off tighter at the top so a rabbit could not work its snout underneath. He wrote in the notebook, "Rabbits work behind loose wrap, wrap tighter, longer, overlap the ground." He underlined it twice. He did not tell anyone about the 30 dead cuttings. He replanted them himself in April with the last of his hay money, and he wrote out a fresh count of the total living population of the hedge in the back of the notebook, and he moved on. Because that was the only way to move on. When you were 14 years old and you had spent a winter putting sticks in the ground and half of them were dead. Landry watched him do the replanting from the back porch one Sunday afternoon. Landry did not say anything for a while. Then he said the thing he said. You know, Dad already fenced that. Elias kept working. He did not look up. He tamped down the soil around a fresh blackthorn cutting with the heel of his father's glove. You could be helping Dad with the calving, Landry said. You are missing all of it. Elias tamped down the next cutting. You are going to end up a strange person, Elias. Elias did not answer. Landry watched him a while longer. He shook his head. He went inside without another word. Corwin was standing in the kitchen when Landry came in. He had been at the sink washing his hands. He had heard the whole exchange through the open kitchen window. He did not look up when Landry came in. He did not say anything to his older son. He turned off the water. He dried his hands on the towel. He walked past Landry without a word and out the front door and across the yard in the direction of the barn. Landry watched his father go. He did not know exactly what had just happened. He knew that something had. He stood in the kitchen for a while with the feeling of it, and then he went upstairs. And he did not repeat the line about the fence to his brother again that year. The dry spell came in June. It came the way dry spells come in that part of Tennessee without a lot of warning, and it stayed longer than anyone expected. 3 weeks with no rain. The pasture went brown across the top of the ridge and started to go brown down toward the creek. The hens' water had to be refilled twice a day instead of once. The cattle stood in the shade of the pin oaks by the barn and did not move much in the afternoons. The hedge needed water. It needed water because it was young, and because its roots had not gone deep enough yet to find what it needed on its own. And because if it did not get water, it was going to lose another significant fraction of the living cuttings. And Elias had already lost 100 plants in one calendar year, and he was not going to lose more if he could help it. He carried water. He carried water in 5-gallon buckets, 2 at a time, from the pump behind the house to the base of the hedge. 60 yards downhill, 60 yards back for the next load. He did the math one evening in the shed, sitting on an overturned crate with a pencil in his hand. 280 living plants. A gallon per plant, 3 times a week to keep them alive through a dry June. That worked out to 140 gallons per watering, 28 bucket trips, 56 trips up and down the pasture per watering session. Roughly 1.5 miles of walking, 3 times a week he carried it. He carried it before school. He carried it after school. On Saturdays, he carried it in the morning and again in the evening. His shoulders went hard along the tops in a way they had not been hard before. His hands developed calluses at the base of the fingers where the bucket handles rode, and the calluses cracked in the dry heat, and he taped them shut with the electrical tape from the drawer in the kitchen and kept going. On the 12th day of the dry spell, coming back up the pasture with 2 empty buckets, Elias saw his father standing at the top of the slope by the barn. Corwin was watching him. He had a pair of buckets of his own in his hands, full ones. He did not say anything. He turned around and he walked back down toward the hedge with his 2 full buckets, and he set them down at the base of the north face, in the row Elias had not yet reached that day. And he walked back up the slope past his son without a word, and he refilled his buckets at the pump, and he came down again with 2 more full ones. They worked together for the rest of that afternoon. Neither one of them said anything. When they were done, Corwin set his empty buckets down inside the shed and went into the house for supper. And Elias stayed out at the hedge for another 20 minutes, walking the line, checking the soil around the base of each of the plants they had watered together, feeling the dampness with his fingers where the water had soaked in. He did not write about that afternoon in his notebook. He did not have language for it. He wrote about the water amount and about the soil condition, and about the way the young leaves had recovered by evening on the plants that had been watered first that morning. And he closed the notebook and he went inside. Corwin was already at the table. He did not look up when Elias sat down. Neither of them looked at the other for the whole of the meal. Neither of them needed to. The deer came in the second summer. Elias was 15. The hedge was 2 feet high in most places and 3 feet high in a few of the best places. And the tender new growth along the top and along the outer face was the tender new growth of any young hardwood plant in the middle of an Eastern American summer, which is to say that it was exactly the kind of tender new growth a white-tailed deer will walk half a mile for. They found the hedge in early July. Elias walked out on a Saturday morning, and the entire north face of the hedge had been browsed, not stripped bare. That would have been better in a way because it would have been over. The deer had eaten the top 4 inches of new growth off every plant on the exposed side, and they had eaten the new growth off the outer face, and they had left the plants alive but stunted, with the pattern of tight repeated browsing that would keep them stunted for as long as the deer kept coming. The deer were going to keep coming. Elias understood this immediately. It was in the way that the ground had been tramped down along the pasture side of the hedge. It was in the shape of the browsing, which was methodical, worked over from one end to the other, and which suggested that at least 3 or 4 animals had been at it. It was in the fact that the deer had left tracks in the soft ground under the drip line of the pin oaks by the barn, and there were a lot of tracks, more than he had expected. He stood there a long time in the July heat. He understood what he was going to have to do. He went to the shed. He got the roll of woven wire fencing that his father kept for repairs. He got the T-posts. He got the fence pounder. And he walked back down to the hedge. And he began setting a temporary wire fence 3 feet out from the young hedge on the pasture side to protect the growing plants from the deer. He was building a wire fence to protect a living fence that had not yet grown up. He understood how this was going to look. He drove the posts anyway. He set them at 10-foot intervals along the whole exposed side. He unrolled the woven wire and he tensioned it with a come-along and he stapled it to the posts. And by the time the light went out of the pasture that evening, he had put up nearly 200 feet of temporary fencing between the deer and his hedge. Landry came out to look at it after supper. He looked at the wire, he looked at the hedge, he looked at his brother. He did not say the sentence. Elias could see him deciding not to say it, and could see him deciding not to say it a second time, and then a third time, and could see him finally turn around and walk back to the house without saying it. Because even Landry, at 17, standing on the edge of 18, had figured out over the last year and a half that some things you learn to keep to yourself. Elias watched his brother walk back to the house. Then he turned and looked at the wire fence he had just spent a whole Saturday building. It was funny in a way. He knew it was funny. He would look back on it later and think it was funny. It was not funny that afternoon. He went inside for supper. The storm came at the end of August. It came the way storms come in eastern Tennessee in late summer, out of a sky that had been white and heavy since morning, with the air standing still until about 3 in the afternoon and then moving all at once. The wind came out of the northwest at first, which was the direction the hedge had been built to face, because the ridge sat to the north, and any pressure from anything that walked on 4 legs would come from that direction. Elias had built the hedge with the northwest face in mind. He had used Osage orange on that side. He had planted the cuttings tighter on that side. He had gone to more trouble on that side than on any other side. The wind that afternoon shifted about 4:30. It shifted counterclockwise from northwest to west and then from west to southwest. And then, in the way summer storms sometimes do when they are pulling a lot of energy off the plateau country to the west, it swung around to due south and hit the pasture from below. From the direction the hedge had not been built to face. From the direction where the plants were youngest. Because Elias had started his planting on the uphill side that first winter and had worked around to the downhill side only later, and the downhill side was still the weakest part of the whole ring. The wind hit the south face at just past 5 in the evening. Elias was in the barn. He was cleaning tack. His father was in Nashville that day for a livestock auction. Landry was out somewhere with 2 friends and had taken the truck. Odine was in the kitchen. The wind came through the pasture, and Elias heard it before he saw it, and he was already moving toward the barn door when he heard the second sound, which was the sound of something snapping. He got to the door in time to see the south face of his hedge go over. It did not go all the way down. It leaned. Along a 20-foot stretch, the young stems bent under the pressure of the wind, and 3 of the stakes he had driven that spring for the beginning of his laying work cracked at the base and gave, and the whole section of hedge tilted maybe 20 degrees toward the henhouse. The wind kept blowing. Elias ran. He ran across the yard in the rain that had started as he was moving. He ran past the pin oaks. He ran down the slope to the south face of the hedge, and he could see, even before he got there, that if he did not do something in the next 24 hours, the plants that had bent were going to reset into that leaning position, and the shape of the whole south face was going to be wrong for the rest of its life, and the base was not going to close up the way a laid hedge base is supposed to close up. He had 24 hours. He had 24 hours in a storm that was going to blow for another 6. He worked in the rain. He drove new stakes into the ground on the outside face of the leaning section. He drove them with the fence pounder in the mud, with his hands slipping on the wet wood. He set them at 3-foot intervals along the whole 20 feet, and then he ran between the stakes and the young stems, and he pushed each stem back to vertical with his shoulder. And he tied it off to the stake with the wet baling twine he had grabbed on his way out of the barn. The rain came down hard. He worked through the last of the daylight. He worked through supper, which his mother did not call him in for, because she had come to the kitchen window at one point and looked out and seen what he was doing, and had understood that this was not the kind of thing you called a boy in from. He worked by lamplight after full dark. He had brought the barn lantern down from the shed and hung it from the top of the middle stake, and he worked in a circle of yellow light in the middle of a pasture that was black in every other direction, With the rain going sideways across the light and the wind still shoving at the section of hedge he was trying to bring back to true, he tied off the last stem at just before midnight. He stood there in the rain a while longer, wet through, watching the hedge, waiting to see whether the stakes were going to hold. They held. He carried the lantern back to the shed. He hung it on its nail. He came in through the kitchen door at 10 minutes past midnight, and his mother was not up. His father was not home yet from Nashville. Landry had not come back with the truck. The house was dark except for the small light over the stove. He pulled off his soaked boots. He put them by the wood stove. He went upstairs. He got out of his wet clothes. He put on dry ones. He lay down on the bed on top of the blanket because he was too tired to work out how to get under it, and he closed his eyes. Corwin came home at 2 in the morning. He came in through the back door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He noticed the wet boots by the stove. He noticed the mud tracked across the floor where Elias had come in. He noticed, when he walked to the window, that the barn lantern had been moved and re-hung, and that there were fresh stakes in the ground at the south face of the hedge, visible in the pasture light from the pole. He went upstairs. He looked in on Landry. Landry was asleep in his clothes. Corwin closed the door. He looked in on Elias. Elias was asleep on top of the blanket in dry pajamas with his hair still damp against the pillow. Corwin stood in the doorway for a while. Then he went back downstairs. He made a pot of coffee. He did not drink any of it. He set it on the back of the stove where it would stay warm, and he set a clean cup upside down on a saucer on the kitchen table. He went to bed. Elias came downstairs at 6 the next morning. He walked into the kitchen, and there was the cup on the saucer, and there was the pot on the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He drank it standing at the sink, looking out through the window at the south face of the hedge, at the fresh stakes catching the first light, at the section that had held through the night. His hair was still damp. His hands were still cold from the ride down the stairs. The coffee was hot enough to feel through the cup. He did not know what to say about it, and there was nobody in the kitchen to say it to. He drank the coffee. He set the cup down in the sink. He went out to the hedge. He walked the whole south face in the early light. He checked every stake. He checked every stem he had tied off. He checked the ground at the base of the leaning section for evidence of scouring where the water had come through the pasture. He noted the 2 stakes that had shifted slightly in the night and needed to be reset. He noted the section where the stems had held so cleanly that he was going to be able to lay them right into the frame come spring and would not have to redo any of the work he had done in the rain. He got out the notebook. He wrote south face, storm from the south, not expected, reset stakes. Consider planning a windbreak on the south flank next year or leaving space for one in the design of the second ring if there is a second ring, which there might be. He closed the notebook. He went inside. His father was at the table. Corwin looked up as Elias came in. He looked at his son. He did not say anything. He nodded once. He went back to his own coffee. Elias sat down across from him. They ate breakfast without speaking. The spring of the 3rd year came, and the plants had grown into what Elias had been waiting for them to grow into. The stems along the outer face were as thick as a man's thumb near the base. The main leaders had reached 3 feet, 4 feet in the best sections, 5 in the very best. The Osage orange along the northwest face had thrown down a taproot system that Elias could feel resisting when he put his boot against the base of one of the stems and pressed. It resisted the way a young tree resists. The hedge was ready to be laid. Elias had waited 2 years for this. He had walked past the hedge twice a day for 2 years, thinking about the day he was going to walk out with the billhook and start the actual work. The work that would turn a stand of young plants into the woven barrier the booklet described. He had read the section on laying so many times that the pages had gone soft at the corners. He had asked Odessa about it 3 separate times, and she had explained it 3 slightly different ways, each explanation adding something the previous one had not covered. He started on a Saturday morning in the last week of April. He started at the northwest corner, in the section with the Osage orange, because that was where the pressure would come from, and that was where the technique needed to be most secure. He crouched down at the base of the first plant. He set the billhook against the stem 3 inches above the ground, at an angle. He drew it toward himself. The blade cut into the wood. He had spent an hour the night before honing the billhook against Odessa's whetstone, sitting on her porch step with the tool in his lap and the stone in his hand and the light going out over the ridge below her house. She had watched him do it. She had not corrected him. When he had finished, she had taken the billhook from him and tested the edge with her thumbnail and given it back without a word, which he had understood as the closest thing to approval he was likely to get from her. Now in the April sun, the edge went into the blackthorn stem the way it was supposed to. He cut 3/4 of the way through. He stopped. He took hold of the top of the stem with his free hand, and he bent it slowly at the angle the booklet had described. 30 degrees off horizontal, not lower, not higher. The stem folded at the cut. It did not snap. The living tissue along the top of the cut stretched but held. The stem went over onto its side, and Elias wove it through the vertical stake he had already driven, and he tied it off with a piece of jute twine at the far end. He sat back. He looked at what he had done. He had done it right. He moved to the second plant. He worked through that Saturday. He worked through the following one. He worked every afternoon after school for 2 months. He worked in the same pattern the booklet had described, and that Odessa had confirmed, cutting each stem 3/4 through near the base, and bending it and weaving it into the horizontal frame, with the stakes driven every yard to hold the whole structure while the wound healed and the plant sent up new vertical growth from the base and from the wound itself. His hands cracked open on the second week. He wrapped them and kept working. He cracked open different places on the third week. He wrapped those and kept working. By the fourth week, his hands had begun to heal into a shape that would resist the billhook better, calluses laying down in the places where the billhook rode. And the cuts came less often and did not go as deep. Odessa came up the pasture 3 times during those 2 months. The first time she came, she watched him work for maybe 5 minutes from 20 feet away, and then she left without saying anything. The second time she came, she stood closer. She watched him bend a hawthorn stem into position, and she watched him tie it off, and she nodded once, and then she walked back down the pasture. The third time she came was in the 7th week. He was working on a section along the east face, and he was cutting a stem at an angle that was, he could feel as he was cutting it, not quite right. Not wrong enough to ruin the plant, but not quite the angle the booklet had specified. Odessa was suddenly at his shoulder. She reached down. She put her thin, dry finger against the side of the billhook where he had it pressed against the stem, and she rotated the blade about 5 degrees. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Elias adjusted the blade. He finished the cut at the corrected angle. The stem folded exactly the way it was supposed to fold. Odessa was already walking back down the pasture. He watched her go. Her hands were unsteady these days. He had noticed it that spring. Her hand had trembled a little as she had rotated the billhook against the stem, and it trembled a little in general when she was doing anything with her fingers. And he did not know what it meant exactly, but he understood that she had been born in that house on top of Dobbins Road in 1938, and that the number of things she was going to see him build in his life had already begun to be finite. He kept working. He finished the laying at the end of the 3rd week of June. The hedge, when he was done, stood 4 feet high in most places, and slightly higher along the Osage orange section. It was 3 feet thick at the base. The horizontal woven wood was so tightly interlaced with the vertical new growth that a person could not see daylight through it from more than 5 feet away. The base was solid to the ground. There was no gap. He walked the whole thing on the evening he finished. He walked it slowly. He walked it the way Odessa had walked it that first summer, and the way his father had walked the perimeter of the fields on the property since long before Elias was born. He put his hand on the top of the hedge in a few places, and he pushed. It did not move. He stood at the northwest corner as the light was going. He looked up toward the ridge. He did not know what was going to come down off that ridge. He did not know when. He knew only that whatever was coming when it came was going to come first through the tree line at the top of the pasture, and it was going to work its way down along the slope, and it was going to arrive at the hedge with its full appetite intact and its full weight behind its shoulders. The hedge was ready. That was the summer Doyle Barkley came to see his father. It was late October, and the leaves along the ridge had gone the color they went in that part of the country in the last week before the trees let them go. The air had the smell of wet oak and hickory and the beginning of the year turning. Elias was in the barn changing out the belt on a small hay conveyor when he heard the sound of a truck coming up the drive. He looked out through the barn door. It was Doyle's truck. He watched Doyle park at the side of the house and get out. He watched his father come out of the front door and stand on the porch. He watched them shake hands. Elias did not go inside. He kept working on the belt. He did the work he had come out to do. But the barn was quiet enough that with the window on the north side propped open, the way it was propped open most days that time of year, he could hear the porch clearly. And what he heard was Doyle Barkley offering to buy the 40 acres on the east side of the Marchand property, the acres that ran up to meet the ridge, the acres that had been part of the family since 1921. Doyle was offering 10% over what the county assessor said the land was worth. He was offering to close by Christmas. He was talking about cattle rotation. He was talking about efficiencies of scale. He was talking about the difficulty in 5 or 10 more years of anyone making a living on 160 acres, and about how the smart move for a man Corwin's age was to consolidate down to what he could manage cleanly and take the cash on the rest. Corwin did not answer right away. Elias could not hear his father's silence exactly from the barn, but he could hear that his father had not answered because Doyle kept talking, the way a man keeps talking when he has been expecting an answer and has not received one. Doyle went through his pitch a second time in slightly different words. He mentioned the price a second time. Corwin still did not answer. Corwin said, eventually, that he would think about it. He said it in the voice he used when he was not saying yes and was not saying no. And Elias in the barn, listening through the open window with a wrench in his hand and the belt half installed on the hay conveyor, understood something he had never quite understood about his father before. His father did not know what to say. Elias had never heard his father not know what to say. He kept working on the belt. He heard Doyle say goodbye. He heard the truck start up. He heard it back down the drive and turn onto the county road. He did not come out of the barn until his father had gone back inside the house. That night, after supper, Elias put on his coat and went out to the hedge. He did not bring the notebook. He did not bring the bill hook. He walked out to the northwest corner in the dark, and he stood there for a long time with one hand resting on the top of the woven growth, feeling the bark under his palm. The 40 acres that Doyle wanted to buy were the acres that ran up to meet the ridge. If those acres left the family, the ridge would belong to Doyle. Doyle would cut the timber. He would run cattle where the trees had been, and everything that lived on that ridge, everything that had bedded down there and hunted there and denned there, would be pushed off, would come down, would come looking here. Elias stood in the dark and looked up toward the ridgeline, which was black against a sky that was slightly less black. He did not go inside for a long time. When he did finally go inside, he did not write anything in the notebook that night. He sat on the edge of his bed with the notebook in his hand. He looked at it. He did not open it. He set it back on the small pine desk under the window, and he lay down, and he did not sleep until sometime after 2 in the morning. And the last thing he thought about before he slept was the tuft of gray fur that he did not yet know was going to be caught on his thorns in 15 months' time, at knee height, in the pale white light of a February morning that was still, that October night, waiting for him further along the road he had chosen, without entirely knowing he was choosing. The winter Elias Marchand turned 16 came in early, and it came in hard. There had been signs through the fall. The mass crop had failed on the ridge, which meant the acorns and the hickory nuts that should have carried the deer and the smaller game through the winter had not been there when they were needed. The apples in the wild orchards along the county line had come in thin and had dropped early. Somebody had shot a bear over near Hohenwald in the second week of November, which was late enough in the year that the bear should have been denning already and had not been, which meant the bear had been out looking for food when it should have been sleeping. Elias had noticed all of it. He had noticed that the deer had come down out of the ridge in numbers he had not seen before, and were bedding in the pasture below the barn in ways they had not bedded in his lifetime. He had noticed that the coyote sign along the tree line had gone from occasional to steady over the course of October. He had noticed that the 2 barn cats had begun coming in earlier at night and had stopped going out at all after dark by the middle of December. He did not tell anyone what he was noticing. He wrote it down in the notebook, and he checked the hedge every morning before school and every afternoon after school, and he checked the henhouse door twice each evening to make sure the latch was seated and the small metal hasp had caught. And he walked the perimeter of the whole ring one last time each night with a flashlight, running the beam along the base of the hedge from 6 inches away, looking for any sign of digging. There was no sign of digging. There had not been any all fall, but something was moving on the ridge. Something was moving through the woods above the property, and something was going to come down. Elias understood this the way he had understood, at 13, that the deer bedding pattern in the low pasture had changed. He did not need to be told. He needed only to have been paying attention. The first week of February it started. Callum Trammell had a small flock 2 miles south of the Marchand place. He ran maybe 50 birds, mostly for his own household, and for a small egg root he had built up over the years for a handful of neighbors. On a Wednesday morning in the first week of February, Callum walked out to his henhouse and found the wire dug under in 2 places and 31 of his 50 birds gone. What had come through had not stopped when it was full. It had killed birds it did not intend to eat and had left them in the run, and had carried off the rest. The word came into Miss Yarborough's feed store by noon. Elias heard it that afternoon when his mother stopped at the store on their way home from Waynesboro. He was in the truck. His mother went in to pick up the sack of layer pellets she had ordered. She came back out to the truck with the sack over one shoulder, and her face set in a way Elias had learned to read over the years, which was the way her face got when she had heard something she needed to think about before she said it out loud. She put the sack in the truck bed. She got in. She drove them out of the parking lot before she said anything. Then at the 4-way stop at the edge of town, she looked over at Elias. Callum Trammell lost 31 birds last night. Elias did not say anything. To what? Coyotes. She let the truck idle at the stop for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she took her foot off the brake and rolled through. They drove home without speaking. That evening, Elias walked the hedge with the flashlight and did not find any sign of digging. And he checked the henhouse door twice. And he stood at the northwest corner for a long time in the cold before he went inside for supper. He did not write anything in the notebook that night. He set the notebook on the pine desk under the window and looked at it for a moment, and then went to bed. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, Rufus Doak walked out to his henhouse and found the door standing open. Rufus was 78 years old. He had kept chickens on the same piece of ground for 50 years. In 50 years, he had lost the occasional hen, the way any man who keeps chickens loses the occasional hen, and once he had lost 4 in a bad week to a raccoon that he had eventually caught and dispatched. And one time in the winter of his 42nd year of keeping birds, he had lost a rooster to what he was fairly certain had been a great horned owl. He had never in 50 years lost more than 5 birds in a single incident. That Sunday morning, he lost 19. 11 were gone, 8 were dead in the yard. Rufus stood in his yard a long time. His hands were in the pockets of his coat. He did not go inside for a while. He looked at the birds. He looked at the coop. He walked the perimeter of the wire once, slowly, and he found the 2 places where whatever had come under. The wire was pushed up. The dirt was churned. He walked back to the birds. He looked at them again. Then he went inside. He did not come back out that day. Miss Yarborough told Elias about it on the following Tuesday. She told him about it standing at the counter, ringing up a small purchase of twine, in a voice she used when she was passing along something that had already begun to travel and would keep traveling regardless of whether she passed it along or not. Elias listened. He paid for the twine. He walked out to the truck where his mother was waiting. That night he sat at his desk with the notebook open in front of him, and he did not write anything in it. He looked at the last entry he had made, which had been 3 weeks earlier, about a repair he had done to the tie-off on one of the stems along the east face. He read the entry twice. He closed the notebook. He set it on the desk. He went to bed. The night the Coyotes came to the Marchand place, Elias woke up at 10 minutes to 2 in the morning. He did not know why he woke up. He was in the habit by then of sleeping lightly through the winter months. He had left the window open 2 inches all fall. The cold air came in across the sill and moved against the top edge of his blanket, and he lay in the dark for a moment listening to the sound of the house, which was the sound of a house that was quiet. Then he heard it. It came from the top of the pasture. It came from up near the ridge line. A single yip, followed by another one further along the tree line, followed by a third one that was low and different in tone from the first 2. Elias got out of bed. He got out of bed without turning on the lamp. He walked to the window in his sock feet. He stood at the window and he looked out across the pasture toward the ridge, and he could not see anything because the moon was not much, and the ridge was black against a sky that was only slightly less black. But he could hear. He could hear the yipping start to move. It moved along the tree line from left to right at first, and then it moved lower, coming down the slope of the pasture in the way water moves down a slope. And there were more voices in it now than there had been at first, and Elias understood, standing at the window in his sock feet, that there were at least 6 of them and possibly more. The sound of the pack moving down the pasture reached the low ground about 2:15. Elias heard his father get up. Corwin's footsteps came down the hall. They did not stop at Elias's door. They went past. They went down the stairs slowly, at the pace of a man who had spent his life going down those stairs and knew where every one of them creaked. Elias heard the front door open. He heard his father's boots on the porch. He did not go downstairs. He stood at the window. He heard the yipping reach the henhouse. He heard it stop. He heard it circle. He heard the sound of digging, muffled by distance, but audible in the cold night air that carried sound the way cold night air carries sound in that part of the country. He held his breath. He did not know he was holding his breath until he had already been holding it for a while. The digging went on for a long time, longer than he would have thought a coyote would work at a single spot. It stopped and started. It moved to a new place along the ring and started again. It moved to a third place. Somewhere in there, the yipping resumed, in a lower register, and Elias understood that the animals were communicating with each other about what they were finding. What they were finding was that they could not get in. Downstairs, his father was not moving. Elias could hear that his father was not moving. Corwin was on the porch. He had the flashlight, probably. He was standing there in the cold with the flashlight in his hand, and he was not shining it, and he was not going out into the yard, because there was no point in going out into the yard. Whatever was going to happen at the hedge, and the hedge was either going to hold or it was not going to hold. And a man on a porch with a flashlight and a rifle was not going to change that outcome one way or the other. Elias heard his mother in the kitchen. He had not heard her come downstairs. She must have come down while he was listening to the digging. He could hear her moving around down there. He could hear the kettle going on the stove. That was what she did when she needed to have something in her hands. She made tea. Nobody went out to the henhouse. Nobody was going to go out to the henhouse. What was going to happen was going to happen. And the three people in the Marchand house that night, at 2:30 in the morning in the first week of February, were going to trust the thing that Elias had built. They trusted it. They trusted it in three separate parts of the same house without speaking to each other about. And Elias, at the window on the second floor, understood that this was what his family had been doing in the dark for the last hour. All of them awake, all of them listening, all of them trusting a fence made out of sticks that a boy had planted when he was 14. The digging stopped at 10 minutes past 3. The yipping picked up again. It moved off the low ground. It moved along the creek line toward the west, and it faded, and after a while it was gone. Elias stood at the window until he could not hear anything at all. Then he went downstairs. His father was still on the porch. He came in through the front door as Elias came down the stairs, and the two of them met in the front hall. And Corwin looked at his son, and Elias looked at his father, and neither of them said anything. Corwin set the flashlight down on the small table by the door. He went into the kitchen. Odine was at the table with a cup of tea in front of her. She had made a cup for Corwin, and she had made a cup for Elias, and the two cups were sitting across the table from her, with the steam still rising off them. They sat down, they drank the tea, nobody said anything for a long time. Then Odine set her cup down and she looked at her son. "You did good." That was all she said. Elias nodded. Corwin drank his tea. They sat there in the kitchen at 3:30 in the morning until Elias's hands had stopped shaking, which he had not realized they had been doing, and then they all went back to bed. And nobody in the Marchand house slept until the light came in the windows an hour and a half later. And the day started, and it was time to go out and see what the night had left. What the night had left was what Elias had already described. He had walked the hedge in the pale white February light, and he had found the ground churned in a wide band. And he had found the 3 deep dig sites where the coyotes had gotten serious, and he had found the mat of hawthorn root that had stopped them. He had found the tufts of gray fur caught on the thorns at knee height. He had walked the whole circumference twice. He had checked the henhouse. He had counted the birds, 200 alive. The hedge had held. The hedge was going to keep holding. The same night the coyotes came to the Marchand place, they came to Doyle Barclay's. They came down the west slope of the ridge. Off the piece of ground Doyle had declared it improved and fenced, with $80,000 worth of galvanized wire and treated posts 18 months earlier. Doyle had built a large modern henhouse the previous spring in anticipation of a contract with a restaurant group out of Nashville that had wanted a source of local eggs at scale. He had put 350 birds into it. He had wrapped it in the best wire money could buy in Perry County, Tennessee. The coyotes had dug under the wire in 4 places. They had gone through the whole flock in a night. The contract with the restaurant group did not survive the loss. The story of what had happened at the Barclay place traveled through the county the way that kind of story travels. And by the end of the following week, it had reached everywhere it was going to reach. And Doyle did not come to Miss Yarborough's feed store for 2 weeks after the night the coyotes came. When he finally did come, he did not tell the story himself. He picked up his order and he paid for it and he left. And Miss Yarborough did not ask him about it because she had known Doyle Barclay since he was a boy and she knew when to leave a thing alone. Elias did not know about Doyle's flock until the following Thursday, when Miss Yarborough mentioned it in passing while his mother was picking up chicken feed. He heard it. He did not say anything. He carried the sack out to the truck. He rode home in the passenger seat with the sack of feed on his lap because it did not quite fit in the truck bed with what else was back there. And he looked out the window at the ridge as they drove past the eastern edge of the Marchand property. And he thought about the coyotes moving off toward the creek at 10 minutes past 3 in the morning. And he thought about them turning west. And he thought about where they would have gone from there. He did not feel anything about Doyle. He did not feel anything about Doyle because he had never felt anything about Doyle. Doyle had been a man at a feed store who had said a word and the word had traveled, and it had been a word Doyle believed to be true when he said it. Doyle had made an offer for 40 acres, and the offer had been an offer, and Elias had never held any of that against him in the sense of holding a thing against a person. It had all been part of the same weather that had produced the frost and the rabbits and the deer and the wind out of the south in late August. It had been part of what a boy building a hedge had to build the hedge through. The hedge had been built. The hedge had held. The rest of it was going to sort itself out. Rufus Doak came over the following week. He came on a Wednesday afternoon. It was cold and clear. The frost that morning had lifted by noon, and the pasture was brown and hard, and the sun was coming down through the pin oaks in the slant that late winter sun comes down in that part of the country. Rufus's truck came up the drive slowly. Rufus himself got out of it slowly. He was 78 years old and he had lost 19 birds 10 days earlier, and he moved the way a man that age moves when he has been carrying something heavy for a while. Elias was in the barn. He came out when he heard the truck. Rufus was standing at the edge of the yard, looking at the hedge. He did not look at Elias. He walked toward the hedge. He walked slowly. Elias walked toward him from the barn, and they met near the northwest corner. And Rufus did not greet him, and Elias did not greet him because they did not need to. Rufus walked the hedge. He walked it slowly, all the way around, the way a man walks a thing he is trying to understand. He stopped at each of the 3 dig sites and looked at the ground and did not say anything. He came to a stretch along the east face and put out his hand and touched a tuft of fur that was still caught in the thorns there. He looked at the fur for a while. He kept walking. He came all the way back around to the northwest corner, where Elias was still standing. He put his hand on the top of the hedge. He pushed. The hedge did not move, not the top, not the middle, not the base. His hand pressed against the woven growth, and the growth held against his hand. And after a moment he took his hand away and he looked at his palm, as if he could learn something from what had been pressed against it. He turned to Elias. He looked at him for a long time. "How long?" "3 years," Elias said. Rufus nodded slowly. He looked back at the hedge. He looked at it for a while longer. Then he said the thing he had come to say. "I have got 3 years," Elias nodded. Rufus looked at him a moment more. Then he turned around and he walked back to his truck, at the pace of a 78-year-old man who has come to a decision he did not want to have to come to. And he got into the truck and he sat there for a minute with his hands on the steering wheel before he turned the key. He drove down the drive. Elias watched him go. He did not go back to the barn right away. He stood at the northwest corner of the hedge and he watched Rufus Stokes' truck pull out onto the county road. And he thought about a man who had kept chickens on the same piece of ground for 50 years, and about what it had cost that man to drive up the Marchand Drive that afternoon. Then he turned around and he walked back to the barn to finish what he had been doing. Rufus Doak planted his first row of cuttings the following March. He came to Elias for advice about the spacing, and Elias walked him through what he had learned about the east side spacing, which was that 6 inches was better than 8. And he walked him through what he had learned about the burlap wrap, which needed to overlap the ground and be tied tight enough that a rabbit could not work its snout up under it. He gave Rufus the phone number for the nursery in Kentucky that had good hawthorn stock. Rufus took the number. He did not thank Elias. He nodded once and got back in his truck and drove down the drive, and Elias understood that the not thanking was the point. That some kinds of debt a man does not settle with words. That the settling of that particular debt was going to happen over the next 3 years, in the dirt at the edge of Rufus Doak's henhouse, one cutting at a time, and that Elias was welcome to walk over and check on it any time he wanted to. Callum Trammell planted the following month. Callum came to Elias too. He asked about the Osage orange and about which side of his ring should get it, and Elias walked over to Callum's place one Saturday and looked at the layout and marked out with baling twine where the pressure was going to come from and where the Osage orange should go. The Kesslers planted in April. They did not come to Elias for advice. They watched what Rufus and Callum were doing, and they figured out enough of it on their own, and they planted their own ring. A family over on Cedar Branch that Elias had never met planted in May. They had heard about the Marchand Hedge from a cousin who had heard about it from Miss Yarborough. They planted their ring without ever coming to look at Elias's, and Elias never met them. And by the fall of that year, there were rings of laid hedges going in around henhouses up and down that end of Perry County. And nobody had called a meeting about it, and nobody had written it up in the county extension bulletin. And it moved the way useful things move on working land, quietly, from one man's fence line to the next. In the season after somebody had gotten hurt, Odessa Halloran came up to see it one afternoon in May. She was 82 years old that spring. Her hands were unsteadier than they had been the year before. She had begun using a cane, though she used it grudgingly and did not lean on it more than she had to. She had not been up to see the hedge since Elias had finished laying it the previous summer. She had heard about the night the Coyotes had come, and she had heard about Rufus Doak's visit. And she had decided that spring that she wanted to walk the finished thing for herself, now that the story around it was complete. She had Elias's mother drive her over. She got out of the truck at the top of the drive, and she walked down toward the hedge without help, though the walk was slow and she had to stop twice to rest. Elias met her at the edge of the yard. She did not say anything to him. She walked to the hedge. She stood at the northwest corner. She put her hand on the top of the woven growth. She stood there a while, feeling the bark under her palm, looking along the length of the hedge in both directions. She walked slowly along the outer face. Elias walked beside her, without speaking, at the pace she was walking. She stopped every so often. She touched the wood in different places. She looked at the base once, bending forward a little to see, and she nodded to herself. At the section along the east face, where Elias had done his corrective work after the opossum, she stopped for a longer time. She looked at the tight spacing there. She looked at the way the plants had grown into each other. She nodded. She kept walking. At the section along the south face, where the storm had come through and Elias had spent a night in the rain resetting stakes, she stopped again. She looked at the section. She looked up at Elias. She did not say anything about that section either. She kept walking. They came all the way around to the northwest corner. Odessa put her hand on the top of the hedge one last time. She looked at Elias. My grandfather, she said, would have understood exactly what you have done here. Elias nodded. She looked at the hedge again. And he would not have said a word about it, either. That was as close as Odessa Halloran was going to come to praising anything anyone had built in her lifetime. Elias understood it for what it was. He walked her back to the truck. He helped her up into the cab, though she did not need much help. Odin started the engine. Odessa did not look back at the hedge as they drove down the drive. She did not need to. She had seen what she had come to see. Elias watched the truck go. Then he walked back to the barn to finish what he had been doing before she arrived. 3 weeks after the night the Coyotes came, Corwin Marchand drove into town and met Doyle Barkley at Miss Yarborough's feed store. Nobody had arranged the meeting. Corwin had known Doyle would be in the store on Thursday morning, because Doyle was always in the store on Thursday morning to pick up his weekly feed order. And Corwin had driven in with the truck about 10 minutes before Doyle usually arrived, and he had stood at the counter drinking a cup of coffee out of the pot Miss Yarborough kept going on the back shelf. Doyle came in. He saw Corwin. He came over to the counter. The two of them stood there together at the counter for a minute. Neither said anything. Then Corwin set his coffee cup down, and he said 3 sentences to Doyle. He said them quietly. Miss Yarborough was 15 feet away in the back of the store, and she did not hear them. She saw Doyle nod once, and she saw Doyle look at his boots for a moment, and she saw Doyle nod again. And then she saw Doyle walk out of the store without picking up his feed order. He came back an hour later for the feed. He did not mention the conversation to her when he came back. Corwin got in his truck and drove home. Elias found out about the meeting the following Monday when his mother mentioned in passing at supper that Doyle Barkley had withdrawn the offer for the 40 acres. She said it the way she said most things, without emphasis, in the middle of passing a bowl of green beans to Landry. Landry did not know about the offer. He had not heard about the offer. He looked at his mother. He looked at his father. Corwin did not look up from his plate. Landry looked at Elias. Elias looked at his father. Corwin ate his supper. Elias did not ask his father what he had said to Doyle Barkley in Miss Yarborough's feed store that Thursday morning. He did not ask because it was not the kind of thing you asked. What his father had said to Doyle Barkley was between his father and Doyle Barkley. It had been said in the 40 acres was going to stay in the family, and that was all Elias needed to know. He kept eating. Landry looked at his mother again. He looked at his father again. He opened his mouth and then he closed it. He seemed to be figuring something out that he had not quite figured out before. He did not say anything either. The 4 of them finished supper. Odin cleared the plates. Corwin got up to help her with the dishes, which was not something he usually did, and the 2 of them stood at the sink for a while working together, and neither of them said anything, but the working together at the sink was itself a kind of saying. Elias and Landry went out onto the porch. Landry sat down on the top step. Elias stood at the railing. They watched the light go out of the pasture. Landry did not say anything for a long time. Then he said something. He said it in the direction of the pasture, not looking at his brother. I was wrong, he said it once. He did not elaborate. He did not name what he had been wrong about, though both of them knew. Elias did not say anything. He nodded. Landry nodded back. They stayed on the porch until the pasture had gone completely dark, and then they went inside. Late in the June following the winter, the Coyotes had come on an evening when the light was staying in the pasture until nearly 9 o'clock, and the fireflies had begun coming up out of the tall grass along the creek bottom. Corwin Marchand walked out to the barn where his younger son was working. Elias was working on a section of the hedge along the northwest corner, where the Osage orange had put on so much growth in the previous year that he was going to have to lay a second course of horizontal wood across the top to keep the shape of the thing intact. He was crouched down at the base of a stem. He was looking at the wood, working out where to make the cut. Corwin walked up behind him. He did not say anything. He stood there for a minute. Elias stood up. The 2 of them looked at the hedge together. Corwin put his hand on his son's shoulder. He kept it there for a moment. Then he said what he had come to say. Odessa was right. Elias nodded. Corwin took his hand off his son's shoulder. He turned, and he walked back across the yard without hurry, in the way he walked everywhere on his own property. He went into the house. Elias stood at the northwest corner of the hedge for a long time. He did not go back to work right away. He watched the light go out over the ridge. He watched the fireflies come up in the pasture. He put his hand on the top of the hedge, in the spot where his father had put his hand on his shoulder, and he stood there with his hand on the wood. Then he went back to his cutting. The hedge kept growing. It grew through that summer and into the fall of that year, and through the winter that followed, and into the spring after that. Each year, Elias walked the whole circumference in April and did the maintenance work, cutting back the vertical shoots that had grown too far and laying them into the horizontal frame the way Odessa had taught him to. Each year, the hedge got a little taller. Each year, the base got a little thicker. Rufus Doak's hedge came in. Rufus lived long enough to see it. He lived to 84 years old, which was 7 years longer than his own father had lived. And in the last year of his life, he walked his own hedge every morning after breakfast, the way a man walks a thing that has become part of him. When he passed in the fall of the year Elias turned 23, Elias went to the funeral. He stood in the back of the small church in Linden, and he did not speak, but he was there. Callum Trammell's hedge came in the same way. So did the Kesslers. So did the ring the family on Cedar Branch had planted without ever coming to look at Elias's. And by the time Elias Marchand was 25 years old, there were laid hedges around henhouses up and down that end of Perry County, Tennessee. And nobody in the State Department of Agriculture had ever written any of it up, and nobody was going to. Odessa Halloran lived to be 86. She died in the fall of the year Elias turned 19, in the same front room of the same house on top of Dobbins Road where she had been born in 1938. Her house went to a nephew in Chattanooga who came up and cleaned it out that winter. The hedge around her grandfather's kitchen garden was still standing when the nephew sold the property the following spring. The new family put in a garden of their own inside the hedge. It was still standing when Elias was 30. It was still standing when Elias was 40. It was still standing when the wire fence Corwin Marchand had wrapped around the family's henhouse before Elias was born had rusted through, been replaced, and rusted through a second time. That was not a metaphor. That was simply what a hedge does when it is planted properly and laid the way Odessa's grandfather had laid his in 1944, and the way Elias Marchand had laid his own between the ages of 14 and 16 on a piece of ground in Perry County, Tennessee, that had belonged to his family since 1921. Elias took over the Marchand place when Corwin passed, a long time after any of this. The hedge was there when he took it over. The hedge is still there. If you drive up County Road 47 out of Linden and take Dobbins Road east about 3 miles, you can see it from the road, in the pasture below the barn, 60 yards from a henhouse that has been rebuilt twice since Elias's mother first put birds in it when she came onto the property as a bride. It stands about 7 feet high now in the tallest sections. It is 4 feet thick at the base. In the spring, it puts out small white blossoms along the top, and in the fall, the hawthorn berries come in red against the dark leaves, and in the winter, the whole thing goes to gray sticks and thorn. It has never been dug under. It has never been pushed through. Nothing that walks on 4 legs has ever gotten into the Marchand henhouse in the 20-some-odd years since a boy of 14 crouched down in the frozen dirt of a January morning and pressed the first cutting of hawthorn into the ground with the heel of his father's glove, while the whole county was still deciding what to call what he was doing, and had settled on the word decorative, and had been wrong. The boy was not trying to be wise. He was trying to keep 200 hens alive in a place where the ridge came down close to the barn. It always had. He had listened to an old woman who knew something, and he had believed her enough to spend 3 years bleeding for a fence made out of sticks, while everyone he knew thought it was for looks. And when the Coyotes came down out of that ridge in the winter he turned 16, in numbers nobody in that county had seen before, every single person who had smiled at those thorn sticks remembered them very differently. That is how it goes with the work that lasts. Nobody smiles at it while it is being done. Everybody smiles at it after. Elias Marchand walked his hedge every night for the rest of his life. He walked it in the summer when the fireflies came up, and he walked it in the fall when the leaves went red, and he walked it in the winter when the frost held the ground hard as a floor. He walked it the year his father passed. He walked it the year his mother passed. He walked it the year his brother Landry, older by 3 years and always the loud one, called him up on the phone from over in Waynesboro and asked him to come look at the piece of ground he had just bought and help him decide where to put a hedge of his own. Elias drove over that Saturday. He walked the ground with his brother. He marked out with baling twine where the pressure was going to come from and where the Osage orange should go. He walked his hedge the night after he came back from that visit. He stood at the northwest corner in the dark. He put his hand on the top of the woven growth. The wood was cool under his palm. Inside it, something was working slowly and without announcement. The way it had been working since he was 14 years old. The way it would keep working long after he was gone. Doing what a hedge does when you lay it properly, in a place where the ridge comes down close to the barn. In a county where every henhouse in living memory had been wrapped in wire and patched every spring. and where a boy once knelt in the frozen dirt and did something older instead. And that is the story of Elias Marchand, and the hedge he planted when he was 14, and the coyotes that came the winter he turned 16, and the tuft of gray fur that caught on the thorns at knee height in the pale white light of a February morning on a piece of ground in Perry County, Tennessee, that had belonged to a family since 1921.